Hey, it's Professor Wham. I'm going to be doing something a little bit different today because I found something I thought that I had lost. Apparently, at some point, I have no recollection when this was, but apparently at some point, I became a member of an international academic database that will occasionally contact you in contacting me and say things like, your name has been quoted in this paper. Did you write this paper? So a lot of times in the past couple of years, I've spent time saying, because my mundane name, which some of you may know, is a really boring name. There are over 500 of us in New York alone. So a lot of my other namesakes apparently are in the STEM fields. And so I'm constantly having to say, no, I did not write this paper on engineering. No, I did not write this paper on epidemiology about this and that. But anyway, apparently, however, there are some people who are actually looking up a couple of things that I did write that have been published that are in this database. And one of these papers is the very first academic paper that I ever gave in 1999, before I got my PhD, before 9/11, before the internet. There was the internet, but before the internet as we now know it, before most of us had websites, before social media. And this particular paper was important to me because it was my first sort of foray into trying to explore certain things that were of interest to me in an academic format. And this was a paper that was given, it was a paper that came out of the research that I had done for my master's. I had not yet actually I'd started my coursework for my PhD, but I had not actually started my writing and stuff for my PhD. So this was still very much ensconced in what I had done for my master's degree. And it was based on an interview or a series of interviews that I did with this one guy who I kept running into at different UFO conferences that I was kind of circulating around to do my field research for my master's. But in any case, it was God, why can't I talk? The conference that I gave it, at which I gave it, was held at Boston College in Boston, Massachusetts. It was in November of 1999, and it was my first sort of foray on my own somewhere, and I went to Boston. I loved it. I was like, I've got to come to the East Coast, and so within 6 years, I was in the East Coast, and it was a conference on millennialism in the Western Hemisphere. So it was New World Orders, millennialism in the Western Hemisphere. And there was, I don't know if there still is, a millenarian center at Boston College where they study millenarian religions and movements. A millenarian movement is any movement that believes that the end is near, or that the end of the world, that you can kind of trace when the end of the world is going to come. And the end of the world is often referred to, at least in Christian millenarian texts, as the eschaton, or the end of days, the end of history, so to speak. So what I had titled my paper, as you can see here, is "The Plate in My Head is a Government Plot, Visions of the Eschaton and UFO Conspiracy Theory." So this is about UFO conspiracy theory generally, but specifically as it was articulated by this one guy who I kept running into in these UFO conferences, and who I finally got to talk to me. And what was interesting to me about him was that he was not an abductee or contactee. He was not claiming either one of those. And in fact, he didn't believe that abductions occurred. All right. But he did have a particular understanding of what UFOs meant to him, you know. And his story is fascinating. And so, and he's just like one dude, right? So this became the basis for my paper. And what's interesting is that I remember I gave this presentation. The paper was not yet in its final form. And I remember, I don't know if anybody else that was there remembers this, but I remember my presentation as being really shitty. Because it was the first time I was presenting in front of a lot of luminary academicians, and I hadn't like written the whole thing out, and so I was really nervous. So I think I did a shitty job personally, and I was so embarrassed by it that apparently I completely forgot that I actually wrote an entire paper. You know, where they contacted me and they said, "We'd like you to submit your paper to our journal to publish it." And they didn't ask that of everyone. So I wrote a paper and sent it to them, but honestly, I have no memory of writing it at all. So what happened was I started getting these notices at this database I was talking about at the very beginning. I started getting these notices that people were reading this paper. And I was like, that paper is on this database? And so I went and I searched, and by golly, there it was. And I was like, I don't even remember writing this. And so I read it, and I was like, this is pretty good. You know, it needs some editing. You know, I'd certainly write certain parts of it differently now, but it's actually pretty good. And so what I thought I would do is I would just read chunks of it to you, or, you know, read it to you, and then annotate it in various ways, because there are parts of it that are now dated, and there are parts of it that I would rethink now. And but there are parts of it that I think are that are actually very relevant to what's going on right now in the world, you know, with all of the different conspiracy theories that are kind of roaming around. And the only thing I would really add to the paper was that I would distinguish between distinguish a little bit more between an actual conspiracy, of which, of course, there are many, and a conspiracy theory, you know, like, or conspiracy theory as a general sort of principle when approaching the world. And this is going to be different in some ways because I'm not going to be able to actually publish this paper like on my website, because even though I wrote it, it's not, I don't have the copyright for it. It was copyrighted by the journal that published it. So I don't like have the absolute rights to it, although I don't think they would care that I'm doing this. But what I will do is excerpt it, and then on the website, I'm going to create a document where I excerpt parts of it, and then put my commentary in. And then for those of you who may be interested in getting a copy of it, I can probably arrange to figure that out. What I did was, I can point you to the website, the database, but I don't want you to have to become a member in order to get it. Although you can be a free member and get a certain number of free texts. But, you know, I have my own copy of it now. Basically what I did is I've been a free member of this database group because I apparently have a couple of publications in there. And so I requested a copy of it, and you have to say why you want a free copy of it. And so I wrote, because I wrote it, and I don't have a copy of it, because it ended up, you know, my copy of it ended up on a hard drive that died. So I was never able to have my own copy, so now I do. But anyway, this is what the title of it is. As I said, The Plate in My Head is a Government Plot. And yes, it is a good title. It's a great title. In fact, the title of this paper was sufficient in and of itself to push me over the edge and get me my fellowship that I had for a year at the Library of Congress. Because it made the title made two of the trustees laugh. I don't, it's like, good for me, right? So this is how this begins. I'm going to take my glasses off so I can read because the print is very tiny. Harold Bloom, and I don't know if any of you know who Harold Bloom was or is. I don't even know if he's still alive. He was a conservative academic, or is a conservative academic. If he's not dead, he's at least retired. And he wrote something that was called Omens of the Millennium. And in Omens of the Millennium, which was published in 1996, he was bemoaning how Christianity is rife with Gnosticism. Christianity today does not reflect what the Christianity used to be. So he's always moaning about that. But anyway, so this is how this paper starts. Harold Bloom, in his Omens of the Millennium, a very personal meditation on the texts and modalities of the turn of mind we call Gnosticism, tells the humorous story of an encounter he had with fellow Yale colleague and Gnostic ruminator Bentley Leighton, author of the popular scholarly translation, The Gnostic Scriptures. I was familiar with Leighton because he'd been somebody we'd read a lot in my Christian studies classes. Apparently, Bloom had had a long day and was beginning the last trek across campus before going home. He ran into Leighton, who was on his own last migration of the afternoon. Bloom reflects that he must have had a very sour look on his face, for Leighton, upon greeting him, inquired as to why he seemed to be in such a terrible, somber mood. Bloom replied that his feet were killing him. Leighton paused, became thoughtful, raised one finger, and in a deep, prophetically amused voice reportedly answered with a joke that probably only another academician could understand. Ah, that is because of the archon of shoes. And so we begin with the archon of shoes. When I was exposed to Gnosticism many years ago in my Texts of Early Christianity courses, and incidentally to the writings of Leighton, I was struck with how similar the grand Gnostic myth which Leighton described resembled in many ways a modern secular conspiracy theory. According to Leighton's schemata, the Gnostic mindset of those ancients who subscribed, whether pagan, Persian, Jewish, or Christian, shared some basic assumptions, central among these being that humans are in a kind of exile from true knowledge about their origins and final destinies. Gnosticism is generally understood to be a mindset or method of mystical awareness. Most definitions of Gnosticism focus on the personal experiential aspects of that process of coming to know the truth, quote unquote. For indeed, that is what the term Gnostic refers to, knowing, knowledge, a knower. Texts identified as Gnostic often contain instructions about how to gain inner knowledge of one's purpose, destiny, or source, or descriptions, even road maps, if you will, of the inner geography, topography of spiritual, heavenly, or otherworldly realms or experiences. Side note here. The term gnosis in Greek is the cognate of jnana in Sanskrit. And in Hindu texts, Buddhism is often referred to as jnana yoga. That's what it's referred to. That's how what it's called in, say, the Bhagavad Gita. So anyway, Leighton's text, however, reveals the other side of the Gnostic equation, a question that the ancients faced, that we face in our own way, in our own worlds. For the Gnostic, to turn inward toward the self was often to turn away from the world, not necessarily in an ascetic sense, but in the sense that the outer world could give no trusted indication of who or what the self might actually be. Here enters the archon, that instrument of the demiurge. And just to remind those of you who don't know who the demiurge was, the demiurge is in Gnosticism is the false god, the god who proclaims himself to be God. And the term demiurge first appears in Plato's Timaeus and is the term used then because of its Greek association by Neoplatonists like Plotinus, who developed the kind of grand Gnostic myth. So here enters the archon, that instrument of the demiurge, the crafty god who created the physical world and gives humans desire so that we are trapped in the wily labyrinths of physical limitation. What many commentators on Gnosticism and its reported reemergence in current American life, like Harold Bloom, forget to mention is that the personal experiential aspect of the Gnostic spiritual ascent was predicated on precisely the notion that there is something about the physical world that fools us, and indeed that there are powers out there in here who intend to deceive and conceal the deception. In ancient Gnostic texts, these powers are called archons, and they were virtually cabals, that's how they were described, organized by and loyal to the keeper of the secret and the deception, the demiurge. In a sense, Gnostics affirm what Descartes, in his meditation, and this is referring to Descartes' meditation, wherein he attempts to prove the existence of God. And for Descartes, for those of you who may have read this proof, which is a stupid proof, by the way, he admits that the one thing that could disprove this proof would be if there was a deceptive God. If there was a deceptive God, then his proof wouldn't work. That's literally what he says. So Gnostics affirm what Descartes in his meditation most fears, that there is provisional God of the world, quote unquote, and it is a spiteful, deceptive, control-hungry deity. In other words, the sense that some individuals have that they are exiled from their true natures and that something is keeping them from that knowledge is, for the Gnostically inclined, an intuition that is based on something real. Yes, Martha, there is a conspiracy of sorts. And so the Gnostic must seek epistemological certainty and ultimately ontological comfort in other places, namely the personal realities that are revealed by meditation, spiritual practices, and reflection. So let's be more specific. Leighton outlines what he considers to be the central tenets and practices associated with groups who call themselves Gnostic in the ancient world. First, they adhered to a distinctive myth of origins that in its many versions was dualistic, involving an original parent deity and the morally ambivalent creator god, who with his minions kept a strong group identity which emerged in specialized, often exclusive assemblies. Frequently, Christian Gnostics separated themselves in congregations apart from non-Gnostic Christians, which was part of what motivated the Roman Church to declare them heretical. Thirdly, this separation betrayed an overt hostility to non-Gnostics, who were often in the ancient world signified as being children of Cain, Abel's murderous brother. The separatism also signaled a lack of trust in established authorities, political or religious, whose attempts to persecute or limit Gnostic speculation and influence were often regarded as proof that such institutions were agents of the archons of earth. I'm hoping that a lot of this sounds familiar to all of you. Fourthly, Gnostics often employed a special jargon, in-house signifiers that fueled endless correspondences and metaphysical speculations with, quote, the act of interpretation being itself the proof of the larger project of locating the final order of determination. This process of interpretation was regarded as an ever-ongoing effort to draw the past into the present, as correspondences linked and drew the speculator back to the beginning, the cessation of being and the parent of the entirety, which is another name for the ultimate deity, the parent of the entirety. I actually kind of like that term. In addition, there was an emphasis on personal election, spiritual transformation, and even transmutation, usually signified in the ancient Gnostic assemblies through the act of ritual baptism. Finally, Gnostic interpreters often drew upon populist sympathies, appealing to those sentiments in individuals who felt themselves to be exiled from or victims of the Roman body politic. This was true even though the actual reins of power in most Gnostic communities appeared to remain within an elite of intellectuals, simply because in order to understand it, you had to be able to read. And for those of you who are like, oh, this sounds like the Cathars, well, the Cathars are linked to this. The Cathars were apparently one of the last remaining vestiges of Manichaeism. And Manichaeism was a Gnostic church, which developed in the mid to late 3rd century, which was often seen in competition to the developing Roman Church. And it was based on the teachings, the syncretic teachings of Mani, who was a prophet who came out of Persia at the time. And there was a Gnostic flavor to it. You can call it the first and only organized Gnostic church. Most Gnostic communities were not nearly as organized. They didn't have a full ecclesiastical structure. They didn't have a set literature. They had some texts they all liked, but they didn't have like a Bible or anything. But the Manichaeans, they did actually create a Bible. In fact, they created a Bible before the Roman Church did, which is why some scholars believe the Roman Church felt like it had to do that. It's also part of the reason why the Manichaeans were persecuted so intensely, especially in the West, because they were a very real threat to the Roman Church. Anyway, and we can talk about the Manichaeans at some other point. Modern secular conspiracy theories appear to have several discrete origins, and from this I used a book called Conspiracy Theory by an academic named Fenster, whose first name is lost in the bibliography in the back somewhere. So most historians of the conspiracy theory, of the modern conspiracy theory, have linked its primary origins to the political intrigues attending the French Revolution, with more recent developments in this century focusing on the Cold War, the rapid ascension of technologies which give governing institutions powers of surveillance unknown in any other recorded age, the sense of estrangement from the means of capital experienced by many in the United States and around the world, and a number of actual, though not global, conspiracies on the part of American politicians, such as Nixon, for example, and any number of others, the assassination of JFK, etc. This is true even though features or the supposed players in many such theories, such as the persistence of anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic elements, are much older. Although it might be easy for us to dismiss the grosser and seemingly irrational nature of some of the more obvious and well-known conspiracy theories, for example, the takeover of the U.S. by NATO troops, and this was a conspiracy that was attended in the First Persian Gulf War, so that I'm kind of referring to that, and also in the Balkan War, which occurred in the 90s. That's to what I'm referring to. But we have any number of well-known and obvious conspiracy theories, which we're all dealing with all the time right now. Mark Fenster, that's who it was. Mark Fenster, in his extraordinary cultural examination, Conspiracy Theories, Secrecy, and Power in American Culture in 1999, argues that the tendency towards a conspiratorial reading of history can also be found in academics as diverse as Marx in his notion of the forces of history, in Foucault in his ideas of hegemony. In fact, if you read Foucault carefully, there's not a great deal that's different between Foucault's idea of hegemony and the Gnostic idea of archon. They're pretty similar. And Althusser, which might not be somebody that you know, but he had this idea about this notion about ideologies, that ideologies kind of create, well, I guess in an occult sense, an ideology is like an egregore. If you have an ideology that's strong enough, it's like an egregore, and it creates its own realities that then forms selves. Indeed, Mark Fenster contends that conspiratorial readings of history seem to be more the norm in American European society than most who consider themselves rational would care to admit. Moreover, reading conspiracy theory merely as a kind of paranoia disguises the fact that it may reveal actual concerns of the periphery in relation to the center. For example, conspiracy theory often expresses real concerns about individual representation in government, economic and political inequities, and corruption. Rather, Fenster insists that one needs to comprehend not only the political utility of conspiracy, but also the importance of the totalizing effect of conspiracy thinking as it links the individual to historical processes, providing identity, purpose, and meaning in a world where the promises of endless capital are increasingly remote for more and more individuals. I don't know. This sounds kind of prescient for having been written 25 years ago. You tell me. Anyway, Fenster describes conspiracy theory as desire, production, and narrative, and provides a schematic that is startlingly similar to the features detailing Gnosticism found above, albeit these are described and understood in primarily materialist terms. So conspiracy theorists are not dualists in the same way that that Gnostics were, and that they didn't necessarily believe in conspiracy theorists don't necessarily, they might, but they don't necessarily believe in a transcendent world, but they do believe in an us and them. This is kind of, although they think of us and them as being very material in some ways. It's part of the reason why UFO nuts and bolts people have so much issue with some of the actual reports of UFO encounter and abduction. As he outlines it, Fenster, conspiracy theorists just desire to create a totalizing mythology that interprets the present in terms of the past, engages in deliberate use of linking binary, so they kind of fashion dualisms, and specialized signifiers, which both multiply meanings and join disparate elements into unified, albeit often unstable, fields. These specialized jargons, you can tell I'm using some specialized jargons too here, being very academic. These specialized jargons are often the measure of inclusivity. Quote, like Gnostics, conspiracy theorists interpret for individual and small group enlightenment, finding significance in the mundane and wonderment in the apparently explicable. Moreover, conspiracy theories often contain narratives of individual election, enlightenment, or transition, namely when the existence of a conspiracy becomes known, thus motivating individuals to action. God, this sounds prescient. There is obvious hostility to institutions, groups, cabals, or individuals who are deemed to be instruments of the cover-up. Finally, most conspiracy theorists draw on symbolisms and language that Fenster refers to as popular eschatology, the moment when the truth shall be known. So eschatology is the study of the eschaton, the study of the end of days, when history ends. Yet for many conspiracy theorists, as for ancient Gnostics, this moment of revealing is ever receding. Quote, the conspiracy is an enormous structure, always on the horizon of interpretation, and the cause of everything, always the point toward which interpretation moves, but which it never fully reaches. Fenster coins the term epistemophilia, I love that, epistemophilia, to describe this endless yearning for the truth, this intensification of the unknown through imagination, which he argues comes to resemble the Lacanian notion of desire. This is Jacques Lacan, the French critical theorist, and I think he was a psychoanalyst. He was a psychoanalyst. The Lacanian notion of desire, which requires at its core that its ultimate fulfillment be continually deferred. In other words, the conspiracy theorist, while seeking the truth, cannot allow the truth to be finally revealed, or the narrative of interpretive meaning will cease. While the similarities between ancient Gnostics and modern conspiracy theorists are impressive, there are also important differences to consider. Ancient Gnostics believed in a transcendent reality, a literal dualism of flesh and spirit. The interpretive search for truth and meaning focused on becoming a personal knower, a Gnostic, of the existence of that higher transcendence. The desires of the body were regarded as traps, and often, though not always, Gnostics tended towards various ascetic practices. According to their texts and what we know of their historical contexts, most Gnostics were individuals who could no longer expect the wealth and security of the Roman Empire to trickle down their way, and therefore the emphasis was on the renouncing of physical cravings for wealth, ease, and political power. At death, for the Gnostic, the truth would be known. The story would end. Eventually, all people might come to be freed from the traps of the physical world. And then history for everyone would cease. That would be the eschaton. For modern conspiracy theorists in America, a transcendent reality is not necessarily assumed. Therefore, the emphasis is on the conspiracy itself, the deception that lies at the heart of what we think reality might be. For those theorists who adhere to a spiritual version of conspiracy, such as the prolific David Icke, oh, the man. You'd think after 25 years he would have shut up. Anyway, the emphasis is on a theurgic reconstruction of the soul in order to conquer the physical world, thereby exposing the conspiracy and getting the cabals to cough up their material goodies, since culturally many, if not most Americans, expect and demand wealth. Well, and that's not only Americans, but, most people in the UK as well. However, for most conspiracy theorists, the end of days is also often described in ever-receding terms as new signs and moments of evidence complicate the revealing of the final forces and individuals who hold the reins of economic and political power. Unfortunately, if the chain is endless, so the layers of deception are endless and infinite. And if the connections are never completed, then the bare truth remains out of reach. This is part of what Fenster says. The desire for some seemingly transcendent explanation appears to be the central yearning of the conspiracy theorist. Yet if a desired explanation or object were truly forthcoming, one would discover, as Slavoj Zizek puts it, that the really found object is not the reference of desire. The desire never ends, but then neither does the narrative of personal identity and meaning. Still, for both the Gnostic and the conspiracy theorist, the eschaton, or the end of days, is understood generally to be a gradual process, brought upon largely by individual and group effort and occasional assistance from insiders. Therefore, one should not construe that I'm arguing for a perfect continuity between Gnostic and conspiracy theorists. Just a minute, I have to stop for a second. I lost my place. Alrighty, I'm back. Therefore, one should not construe that I'm arguing for a perfect continuity between Gnostic and conspiracy cosmologies. The major objection against Leighton's description of the Gnostic mindset is that his interpretation of it may well be the result of a retroactive projection of present-day assumptions upon a practice which existed in the past and cannot be actually known or understood as it was. On the other hand, one could just as easily say that present-day conspiracy theories represent simply a historically contingent secular version of various mental tendencies that are latently present in civilization, civilizations which have been foundationally constructed out of Christian assumptions, since the majority of historians who research Christian origins do agree that Gnostic traces have been present in most forms of Christianity throughout its history, and especially in many American Protestantisms, evangelical Protestantisms. I would call a lot of that stuff especially the more ecstatic forms of it to be kind of materialist Gnosticisms in an odd sort of way. You've got the dualism, you've got the belief in a transcendent reality, you've got the belief that there's this satanic conspiracy that's trying to keep your soul enslaved to various desires. It's very Gnostic in a lot of ways. Such secular Gnosticisms or material Gnosticisms would represent then the reemergence of a specific trace, in Gramscian terms, of a recurring mental posturing brought upon and brought up by specific sets of historical conditions that would allow for its exposure or its resurfacing. Now, obviously, in this discussion, we are not talking about the typical run-of-the-mill cover-ups, such as Watergate. I would also add, some of the more obvious things about 9/11, the whole Waco thing, the political intrigues of factions in French society during the late 18th century, or the various plots that family members of the Caesar clan made against one another in the Roman world. There are actual plots and counterplots, to be sure. No, we're talking about the global cosmic intrigues about which such overgeneralizations as Archon and hegemony can be made. Furthermore, we are describing the conditions which render Gnosticism's millenarian thinking and conspiracy theory as conceptual, ideological, and strategic performances which lie along a continuum of constructed meaning. Although it is possible to be a millenarian and not a Gnostic, it is very difficult, as Fenster describes it, to be a millenarian and have no sense of conspiracy. Moreover, it is well nigh impossible to be any of the above and not engage in eschatology, even if the end of days is regarded as extremely remote. All of the above are dualistic, all seek to understand and totalize the past while retaining the importance of individual action, identity, experience, and conscience. All can be considered forms of fetishism and metimony precisely because they substitute instrumental power, which is one part of the historical process, for the whole. Now, what does this have to do with the archon of shoes, or with UFO conspiracy theories for that matter? Well, I probably don't have to unpack this as much now as I had to then, but we'll continue. So let's unpack the assumptions in the joke that Leighton told, assumptions that must be present in order for the joke to be funny. We can start with shoes themselves. The conception that shoeness has been so constructed by external forces such as Nike that the pain inflicted on feet is an inevitable result, particularly since feet are so constructed or created or evolved to require, at least in some instances, the wearing of the very artifacts that might hurt them. This illustrates the receding line of correspondences which render disparate elements into a meaningful whole, constituting what Charles Sanders Peirce ironically called the abduction, as the process of interpreting unexplained events by figuring out a law that can explain them. It is this insidious turn, this irony, that the conditions of the physical body itself might require the invention of tools which can further discomfort, or at least not ensure comfort, that can lead the Gnostically minded ascetic down the road of denying bodily pleasures because of the potential for addiction and entrapment, or the conspiracy theorist to contemplate the dark motives of multinationals like Nike. The feet can hurt, despite the fact that they are made for standing and walking, and the hurt is very personal. But most importantly, for the sake of the joke and the Gnostic, and perhaps the conspiracy theorist, the hurting of the feet is also a meaningful thing. It points to the possibility of there being a state of being where there is no pain, where, for the ancients, there are no feet to hurt because the body has been transcended. The truth of the spiritual body is permanent, and the physical body, as temporary, is assured. In Leighton's point, the painful feet can also be a reminder of the future potential, in simple physical terms, of the ability to put one's feet up, to relax, to let go of the obligations of walking, teaching, writing, and talking, which are the activities of those considered fortunate enough to have procured a tenured position. This may have pissed a few people off. The pain points to the reality of an archon, an oppressive power, whose hold over the soul once named can be transcended and overcome with that knowledge. The knowledge of the archon exposes the conspiracy of oppression, the illusion that painful feet and all they might represent are an eternal fact of existence, or as Mark Fenster puts it, quote, in a similar way, conspiracy theory masks the impossible ideals of representative participatory democracy within a capitalist economy, displacing the fears of this impossibility onto fears of conspiracy, condensing these fears into notions of murderous, licentious presidents and secretive cabals, or simply mercenary corporate executives. The conspiracy theorist enjoys his or her symptom, indulging in its practice, reveling in its excess, never fully reaching the fulfillment of desire lest he or she be confronted with the realization that the notion of a willful, secretive conspiracy by an elite cabal is not quite right. So what is a UFO conspiracy theory? In simplest terms, as it has been described by a variety of scholars, and I use Dean, Matheson, Flaherty, these are people who were writing in 1998 and 1999. The classic, but we know what they are. The classic UFO conspiracy theory holds that there have been, at least since 1947, periodic contacts between ETs and the American government, or even more broadly, a conglomeration of world military, government, and economic authorities. These contacts are understood to be literal physical occurrences which the government has covered up for a variety of reasons, which include, but are not limited to, government interest in receiving technology in exchange for research on humans, government interest in controlling the panic level of populations in the face of a possible invasion, or perhaps the government has literally no control over the actions of the ETs and wants to hide knowledge of that fact, or to cover up the testing of technology that has been gotten from ETs either through exchange or by the salvaging of crashes, such as many believers maintain occurred at Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. Actually, most of us are familiar with this narrative line of reasoning since the advent of the show X-Files, and I give the dates on that. It's important to note that in 1999, X-Files was still on the tube. A television series which has fully developed this story, bringing it into the entertainment comfort of any household in America that wishes to indulge. UFO conspiracy theories have been around longer than the current abduction narratives, and in fact have been both a countervoice to that strand of UFO narrative and an occasional support. The first widely read text to make the charge of government conspiracy and cover-up with regard to UFOs was written by Donald Kehoe, Flying Saucers Are Real, in 1950. Despite its out-of-print status, this book has remained a staple for individuals who adhere to a literal UFO conspiracy explanation. Kehoe's text relies on the poor PR handling of UFO cases by the Air Force, such as the Mantell disaster, and seeks to convince readers that instances of bungling were in fact instances of poorly concealed cover-up. The book was followed by Frank Scully's The Flying Saucers in 1950 and Morris K. Jessup's The Case for the UFO in 1955. These texts argued that UFO reports constituted actual observation of legitimate flying artifacts and at the very least implied strongly that the U.S. government was systematically denying access of this information to the American public. As these reports accelerated during the McCarthy era, a fact which has not been lost on UFO historians of the period, and I give several examples here, four different, Devereaux and Brooks Smith and Flaherty and Peebles, the conspiracies of hidden knowledge grew to include the existence of cadres of secret operatives, variously called the Society or Men in Black, according to Gray and Keel, who were said to either work for the military or were actually designed ETs and who occupied themselves with silencing civilian witnesses of UFO activity. And I just realized that I should have said Barker there, not Gray. But anyway, I'm sure that my other academic people reading this completely didn't see that. These conspiratorial narratives were understood by their adherents to be distinct from those individuals. And this is important, actually, because this is 25 years ago. So there was kind of a separation here that you no longer see in the UFO community. Conspiratorial narratives were often understood by their adherents to be distinct from those individuals who were part of what Peoples has termed the contactee movement. And those individuals, such as George Adamski and George Van Tassel, and the other George, whose last name I will not mention, but I call them the Georges, who claim to be in personal and usually spiritual contact with UFOs, or ETs. Conspiracy theorists held that they were nuts and bolts investigators, and they were embarrassed by the bizarre antics and spiritual revelations of, say, George Adamski. So that there was a separation there between the two, which really no longer exists in a lot of ways. UFO conspiracy theorists, such as Philip Corso and Kevin Randall, are my examples, still talk about the betrayal of Project Blue Book, and more recently have been caught up in the renewed conspiratorial ruminations concerning cattle mutilations and the reported crashed UFOs at Roswell and in other ever-expanding locations. Matheson has described this demarcation between the two strands of the American UFO narrative well, and follows it into the advent of abduction accounts, which eventually emerges into American culture with John Fuller's book, The Interrupted Journey, and was mainstreamed with Whitley Strieber's Communion, even more so than with Hopkins. Abduction theorists have tended to shy away from conspiracy theories even though they have often depended heavily on the literal interpretation of the extraterrestrial hypothesis offered by this narrative. Now, I described this tendency in my master's thesis, and the literal interpretation of alien abduction remains the most popular and recognizable narrative of human-alien interaction in American culture. And this was in 1999, despite the fact that many abductees and contactees actually opt for a spiritual interpretation of their reported experiences. Current UFO conspiracy theory straddles some of these possibilities and tends to emphasize that spiritual experiences or information presented by aliens and abductors is probably intended to confuse the victims of these experiences. This is what David Jacobs was saying at the time. This is what Bud Hopkins was saying at the time. That abductions themselves might indeed be yet another ruse by government authorities to cover up human and military genetic experimentation, or that in the style of the X-Files, there may be a worldwide conspiracy to genetically manipulate or alter the human species in accordance with alien or even trilateral designs. This is according to David Icke. In fact, in the current formulations, there is almost no limit to the reach that the New World government can employ with the current technologies of surveillance, computers, and the internet in its intention to control and manipulate the minds of humans who are kept in the dark. As one of my interviewees put it, the government is the present embodiment of Satan, the Antichrist, the entity who creates our world with advertising and keeps us from knowing the truth about ourselves and what reality is. In other words, using a term from another time, the demiurge. So I'm going to stop here for a minute and just talk a little bit about the lead up to the individual whose interview inspired me to do this. First of all, to remind you, this was my first academic paper. This is Boston College. This is a lovely picture of Boston College. This was for the 4th annual conference of the Center of Millennial Studies. That's what it was for. And one thing that I forgot to mention is that part of the reason that I was contacted by this database is that in the last 5 years, this paper has been downloaded and paid for almost 500 times. It is my most popular academic publication. More people, and let me tell you, that doesn't sound like a lot from a publishing perspective, but for academics, for your paper to be read 500 times, that's a lot, okay? And most of these requests are coming from European sources, which I think is interesting. And it's mostly young people that are reading it, which I think is interesting. And as I mentioned, this paper actually got me into the Library of Congress. It got me into the, got me a Kluge Fellowship, which took me to live in Washington, D.C. And from there, I made contacts that enabled me to live in Annapolis for 4 years and teach at the Naval Academy, and it completely changed my life. And from there, was able to come up to New York. So this is the interior reading room, the main reading room of the Library of Congress. It's impossible to see here. If you look really carefully at it, you'll notice that there are these statues around that sort of ring the whole area here. And each one of these statues is supposed to be representing an important civilization that has contributed to the betterment of the world, you know, like with America obviously being the pinnacle. And like only two of these statues, or maybe three, are like of non-white people, non-European people. Like there's one Arab, there's Ibn Sina, and there's one Chinese person, but I don't recall even who it was, whether it was Confucius or somebody else. But everybody else are like, you know, Greeks and Romans and Europeans and, you know, whatever. So as I say here, it's very easy to see that this building is a not very subtle kudos to Western colonialism. There are no Africans, no Native Americans. You know, mostly it's just dead white guys who are you know, providing the impetus for civilization. Now, the interview that I'm going to be discussing here or describing here this interview actually occurred over several installments, but the main part of it was a fairly extended conversation that I had with this guy at the UFO contactee conference that used to be held on an annual basis at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, Wyoming. And this was something that was sponsored by Dr. Leo Sprinkle. In fact, I had to be vetted by Leo Sprinkle as an academician before I was permitted to go to this. And because I was doing this as a study, I wasn't allowed to go into certain kind of group therapeutic sessions because they were considered private, but I was able to go to some others. So but I did meet Dr. Sprinkle. He was a nice guy. He was very overworked. It was very clear. And he certainly had his groupies. In fact, the people who were fans of his referred to him as Guru Leo, which I don't know whether he really appreciated that or not, but there you are. That was the nature of it. And this was like maybe 1994, 1995, something around in there. And here is a kind of classic picture of the Gnostic cosmos. And so, I talked a little bit about that, and I wanted to provide a graphic for it. And this is as articulated by Plotinus. Plotinus was a Neoplatonic philosopher, I believe in the 3rd century, late 3rd century, whose work was extremely influential on people like Augustine, who were responsible for basically developing the early theology of the Roman Church. And in fact, Augustine was a Manichaean, or studying to be a Manichae before he became Christian. And so he would have been very familiar with aspects of this. And if you look at this, you basically see that there's the eons are considered to be both beings and realms, and then there's the lower eons, and then there's this divide. And the divide is basically roughly a physical and a non-physical divide. And it's the same kind of divide that Plato had between the ideal and the real world. And you'll notice that the archons are, in this formulation, the archons are actually the planets. And the proof of you being ensnared was your natal chart. The planets that were in rulership at the time, they were the things that held you in place, or part of what held you in place. And then even further down are the elements, the 5 elements, and these are the Greek elements. And above this, and Yalda both, that's one of the names of the demiurge right there. And he was identified with the God for Christian Gnostics, he was identified with the God of the Old Testament. And then above there, you have the lights and the 12 aeons, and these are beings like Sophia, peace, truth, grace. These are all categories that, like Aristotle and Plato had, of the forms. So these are kind of like the forms. And then if you see up here, this is a Christian Gnostic formulation. You have the Father, the Mother, and the Son. In fact, the Father, Mother, and the Son was often considered an alternative Trinity. And you can see in here kind of also things that will influence the development of the Kabbalistic tree of life later on. So this Gnostic way of looking at things influenced lots of different groups of people. You find it not only in certain forms of Christianity, mystical Christianity, in the Eastern Church in particular, with the importance of Sophia, but you also find it in certain kinds of, like I mentioned, Jewish mysticism. You find it in Manichaeism. You find it in a lot of Islamic mysticism. So Gnosticism and this way of thinking about the world and kind of the language of it was extremely important at different times. And a lot of this language was picked up by different groups of people. And this is just something that I found when I was kind of doing searches on eschaton. Apparently, David Foster Wallace, the late author David Foster Wallace, actually described in one of his texts a game that he referred to as eschaton, or the final event of history. And he described it as a video game. But there apparently has been a video game that has been created based on his description in one of his novels. And it has been described by some as trying to wage World War III with tennis balls. And so I'm just going to have this graphic up here while I talk about this dude that started all this for me. So first of all, Carlo Ginzburg, in his well-known documentary history, The Cheese and the Worms, The Cosmos of a 16th Century Miller, which is a good book actually, argues that while it is not possible for an individual to adequately mirror an entire stage in history, it is possible to get a sense of how a specific person might significantly fashion identity from both oral and written components of his or her environment. If the self is constructed, then by examining selves, individual selves, one should be able to get a sense of currents of construction that were available given an individual's background, education, and intelligence. Now, Ginsburg admits there is no ready explanation which can account for everything an individual might find significant. Cause and effect do not uniformly determine the generation of meaning. Still, finding a singular individual who is willing to tell his or her story outside of a talk show can still be seen as important for cultural historians who are interested in uncovering the narratives of the private person for whom the Gnostic myth or the UFO conspiracy theory seems particularly suited. Enter my informant, Chuck. That's the name he said I could use. While doing research for my master's thesis in religious studies, I spent much of 1993 and 1994, when I wasn't teaching or reading, traveling to various UFO conferences, both large and small. I went to about one a month. I noticed Chuck at the first two conferences I attended, and by the fifth conference in Laramie, Wyoming, we had started talking. We seemed to be hitting the same places at roughly the same time. I knew he wasn't an academic. In our first conversation, started while we were waiting for an abduction forum to end, he introduced himself as a farmer from Arkansas. At a certain point, after we had run into each other several times, I had gathered the gumption to ask him about his travels from conference to conference. How did he have the money or the time to travel, since my experience of farmers is that they really don't have that kind of leisure unless they're retired, and although he appeared to be disabled, he didn't appear to be elderly. He granted me 3 interviews, a gold mine of information about his life and his explanation for traveling the circuit of UFO conferences. We would meet at a conference and at some point pull away from the crowd to have coffee and talk. But the main part of the interview happened at the Laramie, one of the Laramie conventions. Actually, it was the first one that I went to. The story that emerged is one of those accounts that sticks with a person, even a hardened academic like myself, who by now has probably over 500 formal and informal interviews with UFO contactees and abductees under her belt. It was and is a story that I believe can illustrate not only how an individual can construct a narrative of meaning for his or her own life, but how pervasive elements of Gnostic conspiracy are in our culture, and how the UFO conspiracy narratives can function to assist in making personal tragedies into dramas of cosmic proportions, in which the literal confirmation or refutation of facts is less important than the revealing of a hidden knowledge that heretofore was unknown, thus making the incomprehensible, if not completely understood, at least not as oppressive. So Chuck considered himself a nuts and bolts man, a serious believer in the literal existence of aliens and a government cover-up of ET contacts. He regarded abductees as either deluded victims, duped by government forces, or conniving charlatans. By his own account, he was a materialist, not very religious. At the same time, he maintained that the aliens were not evil, but were being painted as either evil or salvific by government forces who were afraid that alien influence would encourage humans to think on their own. What was most important to him was his belief that the knowledge of human-alien interaction and the exposure of government intervention in what he considered a natural process of communication and evolution could generate a material, literal change in society. This was a belief that had been forged by his exposure to specific UFO texts, which he regarded with almost the sanctity of Scripture, although he never probably would have admitted to that, his interaction with other like-minded individuals at UFO conferences, and his own personal interpretation of a tragic experience that had befallen him several years previously. For Chuck insisted that he had physical proof of a government conspiracy to keep him from contacting aliens, and that proof was in his head. As Chuck told the story, he had been raised to be a rural farmer in Arkansas by the son of a rural farmer. He had not finished high school, although he did like to read, since, quote, "there's not a whole lot else to do in the hills where I come from," unquote. He claimed that his prospects for life were pretty ordinary for a person of his socioeconomic background. He was going to farm as his father had, perhaps marry at some point and have some kids. He reports that, in his words, "my dreams were really no larger than that." He liked to read about traveling and watch TV documentaries about faraway countries, but he never thought he'd ever get to see any of those places. However, those plans, such as they were rudely disrupted one evening in 1984 when he was coming home from town on a narrow mountain road. It was dark, and he never saw the truck that hit him head on. The driver was drunk and had neglected to turn on his headlights. Chuck said that the police later told him they estimated the speed of the truck had surpassed 70 miles per hour by the time it hit him. Apparently, Chuck survived only because he was thrown from his vehicle, which was a smaller truck. He hit a tree while airborne and sustained massive head injuries. The drunk driver walked away from the wreck, apparently without even realizing that Chuck was alive, or even there, and had to be tracked down later on. Chuck was discovered by a passing motorist who found the road blocked by the tangled vehicles. By the time Chuck got to the hospital, a tiny rural facility, he was in a coma and near death. Apparently, the hospital didn't have the resources to provide adequate ER assistance given the nature of his injuries, and he was flown to Little Rock with little more than a blood transfusion and almost no hope of survival. He was 28 at the time. A section of his skull had been crushed due to the impact with the tree, and this constituted his most serious injury other than a broken arm. The doctors inserted a plate during surgery in order to replace that part of the skull that had been literally pulverized. When he told me this part of the story, in fact, whenever he spoke of the plate in his head, he would instinctively touch some part of the long scar which ran from under his left ear up the back of his head and well into the hairline. He wore his hair very short, like almost in a buzz cut. Part of his head had a curious flattened shape where one could see the outline of the plate. Although the plate had been inserted with the stated, to us obvious intention of providing protection for brain tissue, his body had not taken well to the metal intrusion, and he had suffered a series of infections as his body attempted to reject the foreign material. Disfiguring scarring occurred, and he sustained additional brain damage, which resulted in motor dysfunctions in both legs and prevented his broken arm from healing properly. It was withered and barely usable. It was one of those instances where practically every effect attempted by medicine goes wrong. Still, every attempt by medicine goes wrong. Still, he survived. But as is unfortunately often the case, in a story we hear all too often in our society, his family was ill-equipped to deal with the medical expenses of his 4-month stay, and he was faced with the prospect of being disabled, unable to do the work he was most used to do and was planning to do for the rest of his life. He was understandably bitter and traumatized. The few modest objectives for his life were irrevocably changed, and he had no idea what to do. During his hospital stay, during those long years but immediate hours of recovery, Chuck read books that members of his family and a few friends brought him, and since they knew he liked to read. One friend brought him a small stack of books that he said he'd gotten at a garage sale. He thought the books were kind of crazy, and that Chuck would get a kick out of reading them. According to Chuck, this small stack of books changed his life, for they were books about UFOs, something about which he had heard very little up to that point, or to which he had paid little attention. And he was able to recall these books very clearly. They'll be familiar to many of you. Flying Saucers Are Real, Contact at Pascagoula by Hickson and William Mendez, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers by Gray Barker, The Mothman Prophecies, The Philadelphia Experiment by Moore and Berlitz. It must be noted that 3 of these books, and this was as of 1999, are quite difficult to obtain, even for the dedicated UFO enthusiast. 4 of them were out of print at the time Chuck read them, although 2 of these have been reprinted in recent years. I think all of them have been, due to consumer demand. 4 of the titles make specific charges about government involvement with various features of UFO or related reports. Contact at Pascagoula is the only detailed description of a fascinating but obscure abduction case, obscure then, which may be an example of a UFO contact hoaxed by the military. That's what even Valet believes it is. The Philadelphia experiment charges the Pentagon with conspiracy during World War II involving accidents occurring during the testing of primitive stealth technologies. These texts riveted Chuck's attention in a way that no other text had ever done before. As he put it, I felt as if a whole new world of possibilities had opened up for me. I felt as if I understood things I had never seen before. And these books put his predicament in a whole other light. Reading those books motivated me to get well, to get that bad stuff behind me. I felt like I needed to get out of the hospital, to get away so that I would have a chance at finding out the truth. And so his recovery advanced much more quickly than the doctors had expected given the complications of his condition. Still, he faced the prospect of not being able to make the living he had made before. He ended up on disability for a while, and by the time I was interviewing him, he was beginning a laborious process of seeking education so that he could do something in the computer field, no mean feat for someone who is crippled and had not yet completed high school. So I asked him, that is part of your story, but so why do you come to these conferences, particularly when you don't buy most of what the folks here are saying about contact and abduction anyway? Recalling the earlier discussion regarding Gnostics and conspiracy theorists, we can begin to approach a deeper understanding of Chuck's forthcoming revelation. In the ancient world, as well as in many of the mystical meanderings of present-day Christians, Jews, Muslims, and New Agers, search for truth and meaning focuses on the experience of coming to know, firsthand, personally, inwardly, the truer, higher source of soul and being. Conspiracy theorists also describe discrete moments in their lives when they intuitively grasp the presence and scope of the world deception. In both systems, the method initially involves renouncing the apparent conditions of the physical world, denying that appearance of those conditions are true fact. Yet for those folks in the modern age who don't believe in a transcendent reality, what is there to focus on but the physical conditions which seem to oppress and entrap? As Martin Luther sought to expose the wiles of the devilish pope, and Augustine could not escape his conviction that the physical body was the literal externalization of a perverse will lying at the very heart of material experience in life, even though they both believed in a transcendent reality which was bestowed by grace, so too does what I have come to call the secular Gnostic concentrate on exposing the conspiracy, the deception at the heart of reality itself, since the conspiracy is all he or she has left. It is a struggle for self that does not depend on the necessary posturing of eternity or a God, but for Chuck it did depend on the hypothesis of extraterrestrial life, as it does for many nuts and bolt UFO believers. As Gnostics posited the necessity for intermediary power, namely the Christ or the Logos, which provided the means by which Gnostics could access, even temporarily, the light of the pleroma or the parent of the entirety. So for many conspiracy theorists such as Chuck, extraterrestrials provide for an intelligence and power that lies outside the system of deception, the hope that the loop of conspiracy can be broken or transcended. By the time Chuck spoke to me, he had come to believe in the following, after he had laboriously reconstructed the events which had befallen him. First, there had been a political scandal at the hospital in which he had stayed. I was unable to follow his rambling recollections of the particulars, but it had something to do with his principal surgeon being indicted along with some minor politicians for nepotism at the hospital and a money laundering scheme. It was probably connected to meth. Through loose connections which were significant to Chuck, involving family and one of his friends, and the difficulties he and his family had in settling the bill, Chuck had come to conclude that the plate which had been put in his head had been prematurely and deliberately placed, not to protect brain tissue, but to encourage the crippling infection. He had concluded that the aliens were similar in kind to the Mothman beings described by John Keel in his so-titled text. They were telepaths, and Chuck defined telepathy in what he considered to be purely scientific terms, directed electromagnetic fields stimulating parts of the temporal lobe. And he might have gotten this from a conference, maybe for some of the writings of Michael Persinger, because Keel himself doesn't talk about this, but Michael Persinger does. The plate in his head prevented him from being able to receive these possible telepathic messages. When I asked him why he had not yet received messages before his accident, he told me that he believed government forces monitored alien activity and sought to prevent contact whenever they could, thus the plate in his head at a strategic moment. So I asked him about the books. How did the books help you understand that this was happening to you, had happened to you? He said that Kehoe's book and the book about the Philadelphia experiment had revealed to him the reach of the long arm of the government and the lengths to which government forces were willing to go to hush people up. The book by Gray Barker, with its detailed description of the covert operatives now famously called the Men in Black, had further confirmed this suspicion. John Keel's book had provided him with a heroic exemplar. He thought of Keel as the bravest man he had ever read about. And the Contact of Pascagoula text had convinced him that what abductions exist are performances by the government. The piste de resistance, though, I can't even say that, piste de resistance, was that the friend who had brought him the books was the very same that was somehow mixed up with the doctor in the ensuing legal entanglement. He now regarded that former friend as a government agent, an informant, a spy. They wanted me to know what they had done to me. They wanted to break my spirit, he said. So Chuck, I asked, why do you come to these conferences, especially since so many of the folks here promote beliefs that you think are silly? I really pressed him on this point. He admitted that he attended the conferences in order to follow the travels of a woman who claims she is in contact with the Ashtar Command, a supposed collective of ET intelligences with which various persons have claimed contact since the time of George Van Tassel. According to Chuck, she operates as his telepathic link to the aliens, since he is physically prevented from reaching them. He claims that the information he gets isn't spiritual, but practical, helping him with job stuff and money and, that kind of thing. Consequently, his contact doesn't channel the Ashtar Command in the manner of New Age mediums, but rather she receives transmissions through a physical implant that she claims to have received via an ET contact. Chuck was quite adamant about this, desiring as he did to separate himself and his telepathic aid from claims made by those who reportedly channel the ascended master Ashtar. Quote, "They help me figure out what I'm going to do. They encourage me to continue my studies. They give me warnings about what to expect. They are my fifth column." Now, Chuck isn't crazy. In fact, I found him to be a very lucid individual, self-possessed, and even though he rambled a bit, not at all incoherent. Neither should we assume that he is a typical believer in UFO conspiracy, because most have not had his difficulties or his reasons to be bitter. Still, he expresses themes that are familiar to most of us: the sense of powerlessness when dealing with pain, physical or emotional trauma, the ambivalence many of us feel when we entrust our well-being to doctors or institutions of health, the specter of losing one's livelihood in a culture where individual worth is defined by what one can produce. There is a resonance in his arguments. Chuck seems familiar to many of us, even those who spurn such entertainments as reality TV and Jerry Springer. How many of us have honestly wondered from time to time, even if only from the secrecy of our personal bedrooms, about what the government, and yes, we use that term, that word, in that way, as Foucault uses the word hegemony, and Apostle Paul uses the term archon, because he does, about what the government is hiding from us, about wars, disease outbreaks, crime, actual conditions of poverty, etc. One has only to listen to the hyperbole regarding Y2K. Do you remember Y2K? Well, and we all know now, the possibilities of computer espionage 25 years hence. Now, of course, it's AI, or to the recent concerns about an outbreak of a Nile virus on the east coast of the U.S. Post-COVID. Post-COVID laughing, black humor. There is enough potential trauma afoot to feed even moderate paranoid tendencies. So finally, I came to ask him about outcome. What will it be like when the truth comes out and when the government forces are exposed? Chuck, do you have an eschatology? He had thought some about this, for he believed that the conspiracy had to be exposed. He said he was doing what little he could by talking to people like me. So I guess I'm his messenger and sharing with others at conferences. He thought that once the people, again a common generic construction that most of us use without really knowing what we're talking about, knew the extent to which they had been deceived, and the government or demiurge would be overthrown naturally. 4chan, 4chan, 4chan. He couldn't tell me where the people would get the physical or political power to do this. Presumably the aliens that are in contact with some of us will assist with practical information. As I listened, I was struck with the simplicity of his end days vision. Often UFO conspiracy theorists have conflicting views about what the world will look like after government lies are exposed. Will the story of cover-up simply end like the X-Files series finally ended at some point? Or will there be new disclosures? Or is there a paradise awaiting our construction of it? Star Trek. Conspiracy eschatology appears to be largely gradual, even though it's ever imminent. Of course, though now we're staring climate change down our face. And conspiracy eschatology says that it's going to come through human effort. But Chuck believed that the ETs would have a hand in our deliverance, albeit behind the scenes. His vision in some ways was as affecting, American and simple as his dreams before his accident had been, a moderate utopia. And I want to quote this to you, because this is extraordinary. What Chuck said, I don't expect perfection. Just a world where poor people can pay their bills, and we can decide what wars to fight in. And if people get hurt, we can take care of them. I want to know the truth. I don't want to be lied to. I don't have to be rich. I just don't want to starve. A simple view, to be sure, one that might seem to be far removed from the present-day realities of nation-states and corporate ventures, but still so much a part of each of us. Interestingly, despite the fact that he isn't a typical UFO conspiracy theorist, his choice of texts is a case in point, I also don't think he's terribly unusual. Bloom's parable of the shoes demonstrates the ability of Gnostic thinking to develop a narrative of cosmic significance out of the most mundane of occurrences, painful feet. From painful feet we move to shoes, to the corporation which makes the shoes, and concurrently from the fact of pain to the physical nature of a world in which pain exists, and from there to the promise of painlessness. Chuck supported by his texts an environment in which the persistent poverty of mountain farmers remains a fact of life, an accident with resulting disabilities, and a scandal at the hospital involving both his principal doctor and a good friend, moved from his pain to the source of pain, the plate to the doctor, to the government of Arkansas, finally to the federal government. The UFO texts provided him with the evidence that governments lie, doctors can be deceitful, and even friends lie if the secret they are concealing is considered explosive enough. None of those things are false. The plate and its painful aftermath was the proof of deception, since, as Chuck reasoned, a deceitful doctor would know how to apply such a device so as to cause maximum damage. Since there was no logical reason for the infection to have been so severe, according to Chuck, the infection defied even the doctor's expectations, there must have been another way it could have been, and a reason for why his trauma had been so debilitating. The why was the cover-up, the information hidden that was only mockingly presented to him in the texts that his insider friend had provided. For Leighton's Gnostic, the eschaton can be initialized in the individual by ascending in the spirit, transcending the limitations of painful feet, or by more simply not wearing shoes if that is determined to be the problem. Chuck's eschaton is not realized in quite the same manner. For Chuck, knowing elements of the truth or that the truth is out there, to paraphrase the X-Files, does not enable him to transcend his situation all at once. So he travels the UFO conference circuit, following the revelations of a woman who acts as his mediator to off-worldly realms. He is not content, although he claims that he is not unhappy, now that he knows where the truth lies. He is another traveler, journeying through the societies of storytelling, secrecy, power, and still unrealized ideals that all of us have constructed together. The last time I saw Chuck, he was standing in line waiting to get into a meeting that concerned itself with the Roswell, New Mexico UFO crash. He nodded at me and disappeared into the crowd of onlookers and believers. About Chuck, now I knew many things. About the others surrounding him, I had barely an inkling. This is 25 years ago. Oh, where we've come since then.